Scrum. I'm not sure what everyone's experience with Scrum is, but this is meant to be just a crash course, just a mental dump of everything that you need to know to essentially you could start Scrum tomorrow. It's going to be a lot of information, and that's just okay. So I wrote a goal down for me as I was doing this. You may have your own goals, but just a basic goal as a PSI associate, I want to learn about the Scrum development methodology so that I can help drive business value and customer satisfaction. Very basic. And there's some criteria to that I hope that I can help drive. By the end of this, you should be able to define some basic Scrum terminology. It may sound weird, but by the end of this, you will know the difference between a pig and a chicken. Also, Scrum roles, and be able to write, hopefully, an effective user story, which is a key to Scrum development. And like I said, this is a crash course. It's going to give you everything that you need to know right now. So it may feel like just a massive fire hose, and that's completely okay. That's the goal of this one. Hopefully it won't take us the full 2 hours, but we blocked it out just in case. You may have fun with that fire hose. You may hate it, and you may get really mad at me, but that's okay. Just a basic agenda for today. We're going to go over kind of the history of Scrum, where it came from. To understand where it came from helps us understand what it is today. Basic overview of the iteration, the process, and then some various facets and components of Scrum, being the backlog, the planning sessions, the daily Scrum, sprint review, retrospective, and then key metrics that we have through the Scrum process. So let's dive right into it with the birth of Scrum. In order to understand it, we've got to understand that Scrum is a development methodology. Just like any other development methodology, it has a software development life cycle. This is a very traditional life cycle. Various implementations of life cycles have the same phases with different names, but overall it's the same order. You start out with an idea, you go through defining that idea, refining the idea, planning a schedule, gathering all the information you need, and then you go into actually design and implement and build that solution. After it's been built and tested, then it gets implemented into the production or the live environment. You maintain it over the years, and then eventually it fades out and something else takes its place, right? So that's just a very basic development life cycle. One of the most, and probably the most traditional development methodologies is the waterfall methodology, which takes the same cycle, the same phases, but literally puts them in a specific order. You first start with initiation, and you only do initiation. You do that from start to finish. Once that is done, then do you only go into the next phase. So just like a waterfall, there is no going backwards. You only go forwards, and each step has a defined path, defined start and end dates, in all of its glory of a specific path. There's benefits to it, right? Because it's so strict, it has a lot of discipline. It's very simple to implement because it's very simple to understand. Here's the first step. When you finish step 1, you go on to step 2. It's very easy to implement. It's very easy to manage because of that. And it's perfect in the world of mass production, for instance. In order to make a can of Coke, we know exactly what it takes to make that can and exactly what it takes to make what's in the can. We know exactly what the inputs are. We know the exact process to turn those inputs into the desired output. So waterfall is a great thing if you know exactly what it takes to get exactly what you want. But there's also some downfalls with waterfall that have been found over the years. Because it is so linear, there is no going back, which means when you go through the initiation phase, you better hope that you found everything you need to know. Or the requirements phase, you better hope that you've gathered all the requirements you will ever need for this project. Excuse me. Because it is so rigid in that in its linear method of going through each phase. Each phase is then owned by separate teams. There's the development team, who obviously owns the development process, but in the traditional sense, you're going to have project managers and business analysts who would own those initiation phases. They're the ones who would gather all the requirements, and they may or may not have any collaboration with the dev team, for better or for worse. It just may not happen. And that's just by definition of those phases. Each phase is by a different team, and there is no guarantee that each team will collaborate with the other teams who own the phases that come later in the cycle. And again, since it is a linear process, everything is planned up front. So you may go through your schedule planning phase and say, we have 2 years for this project. That's the life of the project. And then you spend the next 2 months or however long defining all of the requirements. And you plan everything for the next 2 years. And that has a lot of risks with it. And because you're planning everything up front, those requirements are very strict. And it's hard, nigh impossible, to change that scope. Because if something has to change a year down the road, there's a huge change management process in the traditional sense to get the original documents, the statement of work, the contract. You have to get all of those things changed because they were created so far in advance, which again is just a downfall of waterfall itself. And because of the definition of the waterfall process, there's a certain way that these triple constraints work. Triple constraints is a classic term in project management for time, cost, and scope. The 3 things that every project has to have, right? And because you're planning everything up front, the scope is clearly defined and it is completely fixed. Whereas time and cost are flexible, because it's far more easy to say, oh, after 6 months, we actually think we need 6 more months to do the work, so we're going to float the time, we're going to extend the life of this project, add more money to it. And again, with that downfall, you've got projects that may take 10 years longer than the original plan and cost an extra $10 million to do it than we originally thought. But within waterfall, that's theoretically okay. Even though we don't like to do it, waterfall allows that. The results, the Standish group and version 1 have done surveys every year called the Chaos Survey. And through that, they have found that 86% of projects are either challenged or fail completely. Those projects are all waterfall. Less than 30% of projects actually complete the way that they were originally planned. And 30% of projects are canceled flat out before any work is actually done on them. So fast forward a few years from the olden days of waterfall, and we have this idea of agile. Agile is another way of developing a project. And as you can see, it has the same phases. I trimmed it down a little bit, but it has the same phases. The colors I kept the same. So first you have your initiation, right? You still need to have your idea, and you still need to have some degree of planning, but you don't have everything that waterfall does up front. And once you've planned enough, you go into what we call iterations, and each iteration has its own planning, designing, and analysis phase, and then the developers actually design their work, they build the work, they test the work, and theoretically they can also implement it. And once that's done, we move on to the next iteration, which we repeat the same phases for different units of work. And we keep going through that cyclical process versus waterfall. We keep repeating ourselves. We keep replanning, readjusting, renegotiating as we go, and also developing and implementing as we go, rather than waiting till the very end. Now, because of that, there's a lot of myths with Agile, one of them being we don't plan at all. That is completely not true. Agile still plans. Yes, there is some complaining, but that's okay, which we'll go to a little bit later. Just myths, because Agile is so different from the traditional world. So Agile, in its raw sense, is just an umbrella. Agile itself envelops lots of different development methodologies. Scrum is just one of the many. And there are many implementations of Agile that take bits and pieces from all of the different processes and kind of put them together, kind of the best of all the worlds. But if you want to get to Agile in its heart, you can trace it back to 2001, actually up here at Snowbird, here in Salt Lake. There were 17 veterans from the development world that gathered together for a retreat of sorts. And their whole point was to discuss all of the hardships and headaches that they were having within the traditional world of waterfall. And through that 4 days, they developed what is now called the Agile Manifesto, which it says, "We are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. Through this work, we have come to value individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a plan. That is, while there is value in the items on the right, we value the items on the left more." So what that means is, yes, we need our processes, right? You got to have some sort of a process. You got to have some sort of tool to help drive those processes and help implement those processes. But given the choice, we would always choose the individuals and the interaction with those individuals over the process, if it came down to it. Similarly, if I gave you the most awesome user manual in the world, that would be useless if the software it described didn't do anything. So documentation is important, but we're not going to spend our time on documentation when we could be delivering business value through the working software. And again, contracts, they're just documents. What really is important with the contract is the customer collaboration over it. And then again, following a plan versus responding to change. We do this every day. If you planned a route to take when you're driving, sometimes that road's under construction. Is it more important to sit there and wait for the construction to end so that you can follow your plan? Or would you rather just follow the detour and get to where you need to go? So the plan is important, but given the choice, we'd rather just to respond to change that we know has to happen than to stick to the plan that may be flawed from the beginning. Now, like I said before, Scrum is a subset of Agile, and Scrum actually dates back before the Agile Manifesto. It came out of a paper developed by these two Japanese gentlemen back in 1986 called the New Product Development Game. And in there, they defined a new development methodology or strategy that was inherently flexible and holistic, meaning like holistic health, it looks at not only the body but also the mind. So holistic product development, it envelops everything about the process, and it works, the team works together like to reach a common goal, much like a rugby team, which is where the word scrum comes from rugby, where if you look at football, traditional American football, every single person on that field has a specific duty, and they do it themselves. The team works together, but each individual spot has their own specific duty in that move up the field. Whereas rugby, the whole team literally moves together. If you've ever watched a game, you can almost draw two lines, and two parallel lines being the two opposing teams, and those lines move up and down the field together completely. No one's left behind, and no one's too far ahead. So it's a more holistic approach within the development. Again, that new development game was sourced out of Japan, and that came from the Toyota production system back in the 30s. As some of you may be aware, that was a very revolutionary change to how cars were made. The key term there was just-in-time inventory, meaning there's no value in storing 10,000 car doors if I can only work on 5 at a time. So rather than wasting our time and energy delivering and building this massive inventory, not only to build it but also to store it, it's a huge cost, let's just make what we need right now, plan just enough for what we need right now, we'll use it right now, and then we'll get more when we need it. It makes sense, but very revolutionary. And so Agile and Scrum development came out of this, where we continuously plan, we continuously deliver, and we only plan enough right now to get the job done. And so another facet of Scrum, going back to the holistic approach, is that the team is cross-functional. In an ideal world, we want our developers to be able to develop. All of them should be able to do QA and test. All of them should be able to define requirements. That way, no one is specializing in a specific thing all the time, and the power of that is when one person's out on vacation for a week, we don't want to lose that entire knowledge, or we don't want to have a specific task completely stop while that person is gone. If someone else can do that job as well, if the team is truly cross-functional, then we can continually moving as an entire team. So keys to why Agile works. There's 9 common reasons why Agile works. One of them, the customer is in the driver's seat. As I said before, traditional waterfall, each phase was owned by a specific team. And it was a very common analogy where the BAs, or the business analysts, would define all the requirements. They would pack it up in a grenade. They would throw the grenade over the wall at the developers and hope that they got what they wanted. And because they had a wall, the BA and the customers were never injured by that exploding grenade that would eventually explode. So now with Agile, that wall's been removed. The customer is in the driver's seat. The customer is working with the dev team to drive that business value. Because we're not planning everything up front, we're able to quickly react to the market. Obviously, what works and is needed today will not work and may not be needed at all next year. So why plan for a product to be delivered next year, today, with requirements that we almost can guarantee will be invalid or have to change by the time this thing is actually needed? So Agile, we're planning continuously, we can easily react. Agile has a lot more visibility, which we'll get into with the metrics. There's a lot more information that we can use to track the progress and estimate the future progress of a project. Agile and Scrum were in part created by people from the development world, not so much from the project management world, and it's an ideal environment for a developer. My background is a developer. I came from that background working on both Waterfall and Scrum projects. Team morale goes through the roof with a Scrum project versus Waterfall. Any developer who's working on a Scrum project and doing it well will almost never go back to Waterfall. It's just a perfect environment for the developer. One of the reasons is the team is self-managed. The team governs what they do, and that gives a lot of power when you have choice over what you do. It removes confusion and distraction. There's a certain piece of Scrum that we'll get into that specifically blocks confusion and distraction from the team so the team can actually do their work. Like in Waterfall, we planned everything up front. So again, you almost had to know the future if you're going to do it right. Agile, we don't. We plan as we go, so there's no reason to tell the future anymore. Because we're planning continuously, when things arise, which they will always arise, those impacts are a lot less disruptive to the project and the team because we've only planned enough and we can get around it easily. And then continuous improvement is a key principle that, again, comes out of the Japanese Toyota production system as well. With these triple constraints, the original iron triangle is completely flipped upside down. So what was fixed before, scope, is now completely flexible. Because we're only planning enough right now, we have room and the ability to change the scope next week. We can change the scope as we need to. What we fix instead is the cost and the time. So with the traditional waterfall approach, the question would have been, or the customer would have come to a client or a developer and said, I want you to build me this, and then I want you to tell me how much money it'll cost me and how long it will take. That was the traditional approach. The new Agile approach changes that question to say, I have 6 months and $10 million. What can you build me in that time? And that way it's so much more clear as to what the cost and time is going to be. And because we're fixing cost and time, Agile projects very rarely, if ever, go over budget and over time because we've fixed those times. They have a deadline, and we change the scope to meet that time frame versus changing the time frame to meet the scope. From the same chaos surveys, they interview in Agile companies. 80% of organizations are going Agile out of the 2012 survey. 60% of the organizations use Agile on half or more of their projects. And interestingly enough, since 2012, the U.S. military is requiring all their contractors to use Agile in their approaches. That's part of their contract negotiation with the military because it is so much advanced in its process for those various reasons. Again, Agile versus Waterfall. As you can see on the left, the red line is risk, and the blue is the value. We plan everything up front in Waterfall, and we do all of these phases. So there is absolutely no value delivered to the customer until the very end of the process. And because of that, risk is increasing exponentially every single day. The longer it takes the customer to have their value in hand, the longer we will not know whether or not what we're giving them is what they want. It's a huge risk. If you look at Agile, we plan as we go, we have iterations as we go, we implement as we go. So not only are we delivering value sooner, we're also delivering more value by the end. And since we're delivering value as we go, we're reducing risk because we can deliver a working UI to the client, and they can give us feedback and say, no, that's not what I want, or that's great, but can you add this? And so then we can readjust and replan. So we can add more value sooner, and over time it's just a increased value, and thus massive reducing risk. So that quick history of Agile and Scrum and whatnot. So going into the Scrum process, like I said before, Agile is an iterative methodology, and thus so is Scrum, with several different facets that we're going to go into today. It has different artifacts. The backlog is everything the team's going to do, or everything in the product to do. The sprint backlog is everything the team does right now. And then we have iterations, which within Scrum are 2 to 4 weeks. And again, since we fix the time, we don't ever extend those iterations. If the iteration is 4 weeks, it will always be 4 weeks. We don't extend it. And then at the end of each iteration, we should have something that is ready to be released. And throughout this process, we have ceremonies, or these are the meetings, Scrum ceremonies that happen. One of them is release planning. Another one is backlog grooming or story time, which, again, we're going to get into these in depth coming soon. Sprint planning. Every day, we have a daily Scrum meeting where the team answers 3 questions or discusses 3 topics. At the end of each sprint or iteration, we have a demo and review where the team shows off what they've done. We have a retrospective, which ties into that continuous improvement facet of Agile, where the team gets to meet and discuss the pros and cons of their current work. So the chicken and the pig. You may have heard this story about a chicken and a pig. It's used very commonly in Scrum to define the roles. So the chicken says to the pig, hey, I want to open a restaurant. And the pig says, I don't know. What are we going to call it? The chicken says, how about ham and eggs? And the pig's smart. He realizes that the pig would be committed and the chicken's only involved. The pig has to commit to the effort to give the bacon, whereas the chicken can just give some eggs and they're only involved. Now, how does that apply to Scrum? Within Scrum, we have the Scrum team. These are the pigs. These are the only people in the entire process that are actually committed to doing the work. They're the only ones who actually do the work. Within the Scrum team, you have the product owner, who is responsible for what the team is building. You have a Scrum Master, who protects the team, who facilitates the process and is the authority on the Scrum process. And then you have the team members, the rest of the team. And that team could be developers, could be QA, business analysts, whomever. But that is the Scrum team. Everyone else is a chicken because they are not on the team. Everyone else is. They have their stakeholders. They have say in what goes on. They can provide input. But since they aren't the ones actively doing the work, we can't actually say they are committed to that work. And there's a bonus. There's a rooster. The rooster is someone who is a chicken but just struts around giving useless, uninformed opinions. Dilbert's boss is a great example of a rooster. Yes, Tyler. Unfortunately, client execs are chickens. I will not say that you guys are roosters, but you're at very least chickens. So the Scrum team, a few components of it. The sweet spot for a Scrum team is 7 plus or minus 2 people. So for anywhere from 5 to 9 people is a good size Scrum team. Anywhere bigger than that, you're getting yourself into trouble. I've been on teams that have had 3 people, including myself, which was horrible, to say the least. And I've been on teams that were even bigger than 9, and at that point it just gets too muddy. You'd almost rather just split that team in half. Co-location is a huge part of Scrum. You don't have to be co-located, but there is so much more value in being able to see and work next to the people you work with. I've had experience with teams where we literally shared the same conference room table for 9 months. It was cramped, it was hot, but we got a lot done, and we grew as a team completely. If you can't dedicate your team to a single product, then the team can't fully tap into their potential. It's best to have that team fully committed to a single project and not sharing resources across different projects. Along with that, it's not good to be changing the team members every week. That team has to have a chance to grow and mature together, and so keeping the same team together for a while is nearly invaluable. And then similarly, like we said before, self-managing and cross-functional. Quick overview on the ceremonies. Release planning, it's very high level. It's a very high level roadmap of what's to come, what we think we can do. Release is defined in 2 different ways I've seen. One is the actual installation of a release, and another one's a period of time, like a sprint or an iteration. The end result of release planning is not a commitment. It is still just estimates. And then anyone can attend those things, pigs or chickens. Story time is up to the team. It's the team's chance to look at what's coming in the future. They can do it whenever they want or not at all. It's completely up to them. Sprint planning, like we said, is a planning session at the start of every sprint or iteration. The daily Scrum is 15 minutes every day for the entire team, a chance to touch base. The sprint review and the demo happens at the end of every sprint, and then the retrospective as well at the end of every sprint. Key artifacts. The program backlog is a high-level list of the work for multiple products. Doesn't have the details in it. We don't need the details in it. We just need to know high level what's the plan or what's coming up for these products. The product backlog is a similarly as the program, but it's for a specific product. It has more detail, and it is the single source of truth. If it isn't on the backlog, it ain't going to happen. The sprint backlog is a subset of the product backlog, and it consists of everything the team is doing right now in the current sprint. Those backlogs have stories, which are descriptions of the unit of work, which we will get into. At the end of sprint planning, you have team objectives, which is essentially the work that they commit to do in the coming sprint. And there's also a definition of done, which is what the team creates. It's kind of their agreement, their constitution, if you will, of what they consider has to happen for every task before it can be considered done. It's a very powerful tool. And there's also a task board, which again is a very powerful tool. It is a visual representation of the work in progress right now. It's traditionally on whiteboards or on the walls using post-it notes. You can see each post-it is a specific task or story, and you can track that visually through the multiple phases left to right. So that everything on the left is yet to be started. Everything on the right should be done and ready to be released. So going into detail on the product backlog. Like I said before, it is the single source of truth. It contains all of the work. If it's not there, it's not going to happen. If it is there, there is no guarantee that it will happen. But at least it's on a roadmap, so to speak. We're aware of that request, that need, and it will be prioritized. The power of a backlog can come when it's completely visible to everyone, and anyone can add to the backlog. It's literally just a list of what we would like to have for that product. It's opportunities, it's not commitments. Again, there's no guarantee that everything on the backlog will ever be implemented. It's just a list of things that we think would be cool to have. The product owner, or the PO, is the one person who manages the backlog. Anyone can add to it, but only the product owner has the authority, if you will, to prioritize that backlog, to say, these are the things I want next. And it's the product owner's responsibility to help drive the value that we get out of the work. So obviously, the things with the highest value get prioritized the highest, and the lowest value are on the bottom, and they may never get done. But that's okay. Andrew, yes, a PDM is a product owner within our organization. Not all the time. I know that there's, within Entrada, I know there's difference, but generally speaking, the PDM would be the product owner. So again, the backlog is just for planning and tracking purposes. It's dynamic because anyone can add to it. And one of the other keys about it is it's progressively getting refined. So items at the very top of the backlog should be fleshed out in full detail so that the team could work on it today. And as you go down the list, we get less and less detail because principle of Agile, we're only going to plan for what we need right now. There's no purpose in planning stuff at the bottom of the list because we might never get to it, or if we do, it'll be years from now or months from now. So there's no reason to invest time in that task right now. So progressively refined. Items on the backlog. Again, the backlog is the single source for everything. So there's different types of items on it. There's stories, which we will look into. There's bugs, chores, which may not add any business value, but the team has to do it. Epics, which are really big stories. Prototypes. So various different things on there, as well as features and themes and spikes. Different terminologies for different things on the backlog. Now, one of the keys of these stories or units of work on the backlog is what we call vertical slices of functionality. So if you picture a layered cake, if you say you want a piece of that cake and I cut you a piece horizontally, you're probably going to feel gypped because I did not give you a layered cake. I gave you an ingredient of the cake, a single layer. That single layer has no value to you whatsoever if what you want is a layered cake. So when we add stuff to the backlog, we need to think about them in vertical slices of functionality, meaning that unit of work, that story for instance, needs to contain all of the layers to deliver that functionality. It needs to contain a UI, if a UI is applicable. It needs to contain the back-end functionality, the code. It needs to have database work. It may need security. It may need, SOX compliance, Sarbanes-Oxley. All of these things are different layers of that slice. And the goal is not to slice horizontally, but to slice vertically. And we want to get those slices small and thin so that we still have all the components vertically, but we have a thin slice of functionality. So an example might be you want to be able to enter your home address on a screen, or your personal information, for instance. Personal information could be credit cards, home address, your dog's name, whatever, right? Rather than delivering everything up front, we could deliver all the functionality for you to be able to enter in your first name. You still get a UI, there's still back-end, there's database work. It's not everything for that entire screen, but it is a complete unit of work vertically for a single component of the screen. And then we can expand on that later. So here's an example. If you were told to clean the house, what would you do? That's very vague. It's very hard to do. You don't know who's asking you to do it. You don't know what the end goal is. It may seem obvious, but you really don't know. You don't know where you should start, and you don't know when you're going to be done. So we can modify that statement. All right, my wife wants me to clean the house. Now, I know the context is my wife, so now I have an idea of what clean the house means because I know what my wife likes, right? Certain things may be more important to her. Now, if my dad were asking me to clean the house, different things would be important to him, which can change the context of cleaning the house. But still, that doesn't answer all of the questions. I don't know what to do yet. So we can further refine this. So my wife wants me to clean the house, or someone to clean the house, because we have dinner guests. Well, that completely changes it, because unless your guests are kind of weird, you're probably not going to have dinner guests in your bedrooms. So now you know cleaning the house does not include the bedrooms. You're probably going to have the living room, the kitchen, those few things where dinner guests may be. But what you originally thought, clean the house, you were probably picturing the entire building, but we've refined that to be a specific subset, and we're doing it by answering these questions. And obviously we can change that work. Removing the who and the why, we can completely change that work. Again, if my dad wants me to clean the house, that can change my work. If I'm cleaning the house because my parents are coming over, or better yet, my in-laws are coming over for the weekend, I may clean the house differently than if dinner guests are coming over. So this story, so to speak, this user story, this requirement, is very important because it helps define the scope of what is actually needed in that unit of work. So again, changing the subject can change the scope of the work, and so can the reason. Understanding why we need this clean, we understand the context, and maybe the developer can think of a better way of doing it if he knew the ultimate reason why we needed the house clean. So a user story comes in this format. It's in a conversational voice. As a blank I want blank so that I can blank. So as a applicant, I want this so that I can do this. Or as a property manager, I want this so that I can do this. They both may want the same thing, but the different people who want it have different reasons for wanting it, and thus different functionalities required for each person. So here's an example. As a game player, I want my rocket to move back and forth when I press left and right so that I can avoid asteroids. That's very specific. It doesn't answer everything, but it's very specific. Now adding that so that I can avoid asteroids, what if we gave this to the development team and they said, you know, we can have you avoid asteroids without using left and right arrows. If your end goal is to avoid asteroids, maybe the unit of work can change to a better solution if the developer is involved with this story. Or another way of asking too, there's no mention of up and down arrows. Do you only want to move left and right to avoid asteroids? Will the asteroids never be coming directly at you and you might never want to go up and down? That's not clearly defined here. So maybe the developer can come back and say, well, maybe up and down is a better way to avoid asteroids, and then we can change the unit of work. So maybe the story could be reworded to say, as a game player, I want my rocket to move so that I can avoid asteroids. I don't care how it moves, I just want to avoid asteroids. And then let the developer figure out a way to do that, which again gives power to the developer. So a good user story has several components. One of them is invest. Independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, sized appropriately, and testable. I won't get into everything on this one. This topic could take hours all by itself. Keys, if the team can't estimate its size, then it's too big. If we can't test it, then we can never know when we've ever finished. If that piece of vertical layered cake is too big, then it's useless to the team. So having it sized right is key. The other one is the 3 C's. Card, conversation, and confirmation. As you saw on this one, this user story is written on a 3x5 card. Within Scrum, it is very common to have 3x5 cards for your backlog. To have them written, have the stories there, because the reason being is you can only fit so much information on a 3x5 card. And even better, it's more common to only write user stories with Sharpies or with thick pointed markers, because that further reduces the amount of space you have for that story. Because the end goal is to get that story concise, to the point, to give everyone enough information right now. Conversation. The user story in and of itself is not a commitment to any work. It is a promise for a future conversation to further refine that work. And then likewise, there's confirmation. We need to understand what is required to actually complete that. And that comes in the form of acceptance criteria, which is typically written on the back of that card. So again, we could reword this story. So as a game player, I want my rocket to move back and forth, I want my rocket to move so that I can avoid asteroids. The criteria of acceptance could be the rocket moves left when I push the left arrow, and the rocket moves right when I push the right arrow, or other things to that effect, right? Those are the criteria for when this will be accepted, and that's the confirmation. Again, with the idea of vertical slices, the story includes all of the work required to deliver that story. So when the team estimates that story, they are thinking, I have to analyze this thing. The story by itself may not be enough information for me, and that's okay. So I need to spend some time designing it, analyzing it. I need to actually build it. I need to test it. I need to verify it. Maybe I have to deploy it. Maybe that's required part of the estimation. So the user story itself, the effort behind it, includes everything. Andrew, we will get into your question later, so keep that in mind. And then Another key to stories, again with vertical slices, you want that vertical slice to be as thin as possible. So stories should be small enough to be able to be finished in 1 or 2 days. And that's because we want to be able to track the progress of the team, which we'll see in the metrics. It's of no use to anybody to have a user story that lasts the entire length of your sprint. Because halfway through the sprint, when I report saying we're still working on this, I can't really say whether we're halfway done or not. All I can say is we're still working on it. We have been for the last 4 days, and we will be for the next 5 days maybe, right? But if I have a story that's 1 or 2 days long, I can knock that out, and ideally my report is, okay, I started this yesterday, I'm going to finish it tomorrow, and move on. So this will tie into your question, Andrew. How can we write better user stories? So taking the same example, clean the house. That's obviously too big. Even if we reworded this to understand who and why, that's still too big, right? But we can decompose that story into 5 other stories at least. Clean the first floor, clean the basement, right? All of those together will get you a clean house. But even then, those are probably too big, right? So we can decompose that one into even more stories. So rather than clean the whole second floor, we can clean each room. Go room by room. Those are more consumable, more doable. But that might, again, be too big. So we can keep going. We can vacuum the floor, wash the windows. We can decompose that work into smaller units of work. And again, that might be too big. For my kids, when they see a huge messy room, it is just too daunting for them. So we break it out. Okay, let's just focus on the Legos right now and do nothing else. Only do the trains and do nothing else, right? So when we start with clean the house, we can break that work down into smaller vertical chunks. So putting away the Legos all by itself is not a complete layered cake. It is not the full clean house. However, I am doing all of the work needed to put away something or to clean something. Now, decomposing stories, as we kind of touched on, there's various sizes, right? The base item unit of work is a story, and those could be user stories like we've been talking about, which is written in the voice of a user. There's also technical stories that the team would write. Now, they need to migrate to a certain kind of database or do something specific to just the team. And then a spike is a term used for a research task. So maybe the team needs to spend some time researching this user story. So we'll make a new spike, allow them time to research it, and then they can move on with the story later. Big stories are epics. Big epics are features. And then you have themes. So a theme contains many features. A feature contains many epics. An epic contains many stories. Some teams will go even smaller and go to a task level. Now, this is not the task that we know in our task system. This is a task which is just sub-steps to complete that story. Now, as you can probably guess, the size of a story is completely variant. What someone may think is small enough may not be. And in my experience, most often, the chickens are always wrong. Because the chickens aren't the ones doing the work. So if you think it's small enough, unfortunately, without the input from the one doing the work, you won't know if it's small enough. Which is not a problem. It's okay. It's just something to be aware of, that the team has to have their chance to say what is good enough for them. Now, Andrew, I missed your question, but hold on to it. We can get to it later. So once we have a backlog with stuff on it, we have to then prioritize it. Figure out what's the most important to do right now. And to me, there's a lot of discussion we can do here, but suffice it to say, the most important thing is that we put the highest value first. If it's not valuable, then let's not waste time doing it right now. Let's do what's most valuable right now. And again, that can be its own topic, which we'll get into in future weeks with the continued sessions. But right now, that's good enough. So sprint planning. Once you have your backlog, your team has to actually get together and plan out what they're going to do for their iteration or for their sprint. So a sprint is a regular, repeatable work cycle. Is that iteration. Originally, when Scrum and Agile started, sprints were listed at about a month long because it was easy to say there's 12 sprints in a year. But over the years, the industry has changed, and the sweet spot right now amongst most companies is a 2-week sprint. It can still vary. It's based on the company, but that's most typical. Anything smaller than a week is just too much of a hassle. Once we define the length of the sprint, we should almost never change it. There are very few reasons that are valid as to why we would want to change the length of the sprint. Consistent cadence is important. We should always start and stop our sprints at the same time. So that way we know every other Monday is a new sprint, or every other Tuesday or Wednesday or whenever. That way you don't have to guess about when the 10th sprint will be from now, because it's always on the same cadence. The scope should not change. This one kind of sounds contradictory to Agile, where scope is flexible, right? Which is true. Scope is flexible. But the team in sprint planning plans their work for the next 2 weeks, and they commit to it. When we commit to it, one of the things that everyone else, all the chickens, one thing that we have to do is let the team work. We have to give them a chance to do their work. So we shouldn't be changing their scope mid-sprint, right? Obviously, things happen. We have urgent bugs. We have big problems that need to be addressed, and that's okay. We can handle that with our planning. But for the most part, we should not be changing the scope of the work, because that just demoralizes the team. I've actually had experience where on past teams, for various reasons, forces of nature, if you will, we ended 3 or 4 sprints back-to-back mid-sprint, and we changed the entire sprint mid-sprint. And in the end, we actually lost a complete month of development time. Because of those constant changes, we got nothing done for a whole month. We just lost it. And that's because we did not adhere, or we were not allowed to adhere to this rule that once the team commits to the work, we don't change it. At the end of the sprint, our end goal is something that is ready to be shipped, ready to be delivered into the live environment. Now, again, it's a vertical slice. It is not the entire process we're delivering. It's just a single subset of the process or the workflow. And there's also, within Scrum, no guarantee that it will be released on live at the end of the sprint. It is ready to be released, so the team can move on. But the actual release cycle is completely independent of the team's work cycle. So sprint planning, it's every sprint. General rule is it's about 90 to 120 minutes per week in the sprint. So a 2-week sprint has ideally about a 4-hour planning period, give or take. It has 2 parts. It's the what and the how. So the what is where the product owner comes to the team and says, this is what I want you to do, or what we're going to do next. And then for the second part of it, the product owner in traditional Scrum would actually leave the room. Because, again, the product owner doesn't really care how it gets done. All we care about is that it gets done. So the product owner leaves the room to help to not influence the team's decisions. And the team then discusses how they're going to get what the product owner wants. This is for the pigs, the Scrum team. Chickens can come, but only when they're invited, because, again, it could be just white noise. That's not going to provide value at that moment. It's also a good idea to have other Scrum team members from other teams in your sprint planning. if there are dependencies that you know need to be addressed. Rather than making assumptions, which are risks, let's just get the people who know in our planning meetings, and we'll remove that risk, and we'll remove the assumption, and we'll plan around it. So again, that first part is the what. The Scrum Master facilitates, the product owner presents the next priorities, and it's the team's time to discuss and ask questions of the product owner. It's the team's chance to get whatever they need to understand what they need to do. And again, those stories that the product owner presents might not be small enough yet. And so the team has the freedom at this point to break down those stories and estimate those stories to be consumable for them. And then the part two, the product owner leaves. The Scrum Master facilitates again. The team calculates their capacity. They discuss the stories in detail. They add stories to their backlog. They add stories up until they filled their capacity. When they're done, the team votes on how confident they are that what they've committed to can actually be accomplished. If the confidence vote is fairly low, then we might need to replan. Move some stuff out until the majority of the team is relatively satisfied in making a commitment or a promise that we can make those things happen. And then you have stretch goals. Because things happen, maybe we're going to get the work done faster. And so we have a list of stretch goals that essentially, here's the next things we're going to do if we have time to do them. If we don't, that's fine. We'll address it next time. Once we're all done, the team basically presents their plan to the product owner. The product owner can then accept it or say, you know what, if you can't, so the team might say, of your top 10 priorities, we can only do these first 4 right now. And the product owner may say, okay, well, given that information, maybe I'd rather have us work on number 6 first. And so the product owner might want to reprioritize based on the findings and the commitments, and that's okay. And again, we can always change. Adjustments can get made for when things happen mid-sprint, but we're not going to change the scope. We're just going to address the disasters. The keys of sprint planning. Like I said before, during release planning, those are not commitments. Those are estimates. The only commitments in Scrum happen after sprint planning. Everything else is an estimate. We can't, if there's any dates being thrown around, we can't hold the team to those dates because the team did not give those dates, did not commit to those dates. And it makes sense because we're planning for a single sprint, which is only 2 weeks. It's a lot easier for us to know how long it will take to walk from your chair to someone else's desk than it is to say how long it will take me to walk from one building to the next. That shorter scope, that shorter time period allows for better estimates. So at the sprint planning is when commitments happen. Again, everything else is an estimate. And only the team can commit. No one else can commit anything for the team but the team because they're the ones who do the work. Everyone else is, in the analogy, a chicken. Part of sprint planning, you have estimation. Estimation is completely relative. You can use whatever scale you want. You can use bucket sizes. You can use t-shirt sizes. You can use animals. You could use superheroes. Doesn't really matter. All that matters is that the scale is understood to everyone. Now the key with this is it's all relative estimation. Looking at that picture of the buckets, you really don't know how big that small bucket is. That could be a pint, it could be a gallon, it could be 10 gallons, you have no idea. That doesn't matter. All that matters is a small is a little bit smaller than a medium, and a medium is a little bit smaller than a large, and likewise large is smaller than extra large. It doesn't matter what the real size is, it's just relative sizes. So you estimate relative size versus relative complexity. A very small size task could be very complex, right? You estimate the effort versus the difficulty. The team gives their own estimates. It's not safe to ever estimate for the team. Again, the method's not important. The scale is not, I mean, however you use it is not important. All that matters is that everyone knows the scale and what it means. Within Scrum, the most common is story points. Story pointing is created based on a modified Fibonacci sequence. As you can see here, we literally have poker cards, a deck of playing cards, and those cards literally have those numbers. Various decks produced by various companies, may change, but the numbers, for the most part, go from 0, 0.5, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 20, 40, 100, infinity, right? It's a modified Fibonacci sequence. When we estimate, we estimate using these points. And again, it's relative. How big it really is a 1, we don't know. Doesn't really matter. All we need to know is a 2 is about twice the size of a 1. It's very typical to find a baseline, so the team will look at all their stories and say, okay, of these 10 stories, this one's the smallest, so we'll say that one's a 1, and then we'll estimate all the other stories relative to the size and complexity of the baseline. That's very common. As we said, during sprint planning, you figure out your capacity. Capacity for me has 2 parts. One part is how much work the team can actually fit into a sprint. And that takes you to take into consideration non-working time, whether it be extra meetings, vacations, whatnot. And because we know disasters will happen and things will happen mid-sprint, it's very good and very common to not fill up 100% of capacity. You want your team to fill up maybe 80, 85% capacity and purposely leave extra room so that we can fill in when extra stuff happens, and then we don't have to impact our commitments. So the first part is how much work can we get done in the sprint. The next part is how much of each kind of work can we do in each sprint. The important thing is here is that we can't always work on new development, but we also can't push it aside either. There's a thing called technical debt, which is problems in the code or inefficiencies in the code that you may create right now, but it's a debt, so you need to go back and pay it later or redo it later. You just can't push it off, because if you keep pushing it off, you're going to end up with a very poor system. And likewise, you can't push off support. You need to address all of these things in your sprint. So here is a good example, a very common example, that a team may only fill up 60% of their time with new work. They might spend 10% of their time refactoring their old code. 10 or 20% could be technical debt, 10% is architecture. You might reserve time for support and whatnot. You have to be able to balance the work throughout the sprint so that you don't leave anything behind. And then definition of done, like we talked about. The team creates it. It's generic for anything. It's not specific to any one task. Each story has its own specific acceptance criteria. That criteria is specific to that one story. But every story has common components. And those common components make up your definition of done. So an example would be, we have to have code reviews. If it's not code reviewed, it's not done. If it's not tested, it's not done. If QA doesn't see it, we can't consider it done. And likewise, the product owner, since he owns the project, he or she, they are the end say in whether or not the story is acceptable or not. So that could be part of definition of done. It's completely up to the team to do it. And since the sprint is not directly tied into the release cycle, your definition of done may not always include installation. An example being one of the companies that make pacemakers. They make pacemakers through Scrum. And likewise, John Deere, they make their tractors through Scrum methodologies. Obviously, they can't deliver half a tractor, but they deliver functional pieces of that tractor, and then they deliver a whole at the end of the year. So their definition of done can't include the release. Otherwise, they'd have nothing done for the entire year. So definition of done varies, and it's the team decides it. Principle of good enough. Perfect is too expensive. No one can afford to be perfect. It takes too much time. What's more important is that it's functional. We don't need to have, right now, the most amazing user interface. Maybe we add some buttons here and there that are square, and we want them rounded. But all that matters is that the button does what it's supposed to do. So let's get the functionality done now, call it good enough, and then we can extend on it later. We can add more stories and make it better later. The key point here is gold plating. We don't want to waste time doing extra work, gold plating a task, and actuality not add real value. So we're not adding any value to the extra time we're spending on those tasks. The daily Scrum is very quick and simple. It's a meeting that the team has every day, usually at the start of the day, but some teams in the industry do it at the end of the day, whenever it works best for the team. It's often standing up at the task board if the team is co-located. Standing up is a good method because it ensures everyone's engaged. It's very hard to fall asleep when you're standing up. So everyone's engaged. And everyone answers 3 questions. What did I do yesterday? What will I do today? And if I have any impediments. One of the roles of the Scrum Master is to protect the team and to facilitate Scrum. So if a team member is working on a task and they run into an impediment, saying, for instance, they need help from this other person, that other person is out, and I don't know who to go to now. Okay? Well, rather than having that person, that team member, spend their time finding someone, the Scrum Master can do that, and it can help remove that impediment. And then through those first 2 questions, we show progress. So I worked on this task yesterday, I will continue today, and I will be done today. And then tomorrow, if they say, oh, I didn't finish today, I didn't finish yesterday, I'll finish today. That's a red flag. It's not the answer. It's a red flag, though, because yesterday they thought they'd be done. So why weren't they done yet? Was there an impediment that they aren't reporting? Or is it getting more complicated than we thought? The key here, again, with time boxing, time is fixed, and we want to keep these meetings to 15-minute time frames. If there's any extra questions or conversations that come up, which often do during Scrum, it's more valuable to table those questions and concerns so that we can get through everyone's reports. And then when we're all done, we can then go back and readdress those questions with only the people who need to be involved in that conversation. And this Scrum meeting is only for the Scrum team. An extension of this is called Scrum of Scrums. It's very common when we have programs or enterprises or areas that have multiple Scrum teams that are interdependent and have cross-dependencies. It's the same idea as a team Scrum. It's 15 minutes. The representatives are one person from every Scrum team. Typically it's the Scrum Master, but not always. The key here is whoever goes needs to be the right person for the job. If the right person to speak in this setting is a technical person, then that's fine. They can be the one to go. But as long as someone's there, every team should be represented. And then you answer the same questions as the daily Scrum. What we did, but now it's the team. What we did yesterday, today, and our impediments. But maybe not in so much detail. Maybe it's just our team is now working on this feature. And our impediment is the database is down right now, and we need help with that. Right? The context is a little bit more high level, and it's for everyone in the area to collaborate. Sprint review. We're going a lot faster than I planned on. This is good. Sprint review happens at the end of every sprint. It's a chance for the team to just present what they've done. Sometimes that's actually functional software. Sometimes they've been researching stuff and they need to actually document and present their findings. and they can walk through new documentation. So if your task was to update the user manual, you want to be able to present your end result and walk through that user manual. Now, the product owner is a literal member of the Scrum team. And going back to those benefits of Agile, where we said the customer representative is in the driver's seat, the product owner is the customer representative. Oftentimes, it's best to have a product owner who comes from the customer realm of things, so they have that customer mindset. But because they're on the team, they should be with the team every day, and they should know the team's working on every day. And so the sprint review is the official point where the product owner gives the official mark of approval. They just go through the motions to check off what's been done. But really, there should be no surprises here. The product owner should know what's been done, should already know what the concerns were. There's no surprises. It's just going through the motions to make it official. It's also very good to have the chickens or the extra stakeholders at these meetings, because while the stakeholders are not on the team doing the work, they are affected by the work, and they're going to want to know what's being done. So it's very good to have these stakeholders at these reviews so that they can see what's been done, what the questions are, and they can see what to expect in the next coming release. And then the team can also field questions from the chickens, from the stakeholders, and maybe those questions drive to better development in the future. But either way, it's very good. Now, similarly with the daily Scrum, has a higher level Scrum of Scrums. There's also a I must have removed. There's a program review. The right there. It is the same idea as a sprint review, but it has all teams participate. Maybe not everyone from the whole team, but at least someone from every team, and it's a chance for every team to present to each other what they're doing. And this may produce more feedback, it may produce more questions, it may produce more solutions. Either way, it's a good idea to have. But in either case, the reviews should be a meeting where we celebrate success, right? The team has accomplished something. It's a chance to celebrate, make it fun. I've had various reviews, and I've seen various teams and companies do reviews that they actually bring in food. They make it a whole day, and they make it a party. It's a great time. But then we also collect the metrics and provide feedback. Retrospective. So going back to the origins of Scrum and Agile, how it came out of Japan with the Toyota, comes a term called Kaizen, or Kaizen. It's a Japanese word that means continuous improvement. The idea being we are continuously planning, we're continuously delivering, we should be continuously improving. If we don't improve, we're just going to get worse over time. And the retrospective allows the team the chance to get better. It happens at every sprint, at the end of it, typically after the demo. It only contains the Scrum team. No exceptions. Only the Scrum team. Because we want this meeting to be fully transparent, and if we have anybody else who's not on the team, that could negatively influence the feedback the team gives. Extreme example, you wouldn't want the CEO in your Scrum, in your retrospective, because the team might have some problems with the company, and they might not be willing to share those problems if certain people are in those meetings. So you want to have full transparency. And we answer 3 questions. What went well during the sprint? What went wrong during the sprint? And then specific ideas on how we can improve, what we can do to improve. And in many cases, these action items on what to do to improve can actually be added to the backlog. They are specific tasks just for the team, but they're on the backlog so that the team remembers to do it, and then we can actually track its progress. If one of the items is the team sits in the same building, but we don't sit near each other, that could be a problem. And what we can do to improve that is see if we can sit next to each other. And so someone might take up that action item to start that discussion about how we can sit next to each other. So it's very specific, and again, very transparent. But also, it should be fun. It's a team building exercise as well. It should be very honest and transparent. Many teams play games in retrospectives. They use this time, other than asking the questions, answering them, to appreciate each other. I've seen teams where they spend 5 minutes writing down thank you notes on a note card for someone else on the team, and it just produces a higher quality team, a better morale. Some teams do team outings for their meetings. They still need to answer those needed questions, but they might take the whole afternoon off and just go out as a team. It's a chance for the team to grow together and become more of a team together. So now we have some metrics, which ties into the transparency and the visibility within Scrum that's increased from the traditional methodologies. So already we've gone through several things that are very easy to measure. We have sprints. We have specific release time periods. We can measure the actual releases through the potentially shippable increments or potentially shippable products. We have stories that we commit. So we have the number of stories we say we're going to get done, and we can track that with how much we actually got done. We have stretch goals. So after every sprint, we commit to 10 stories, and if we have time, we'll do these next 5. And we can measure that. We can measure capacity, which is how much room the team has to do the work. And we have velocity, which we haven't really talked about yet. But velocity is how much work has been done and can be done. So when the team commits to a story, each story should have story points attached to it already. And if we have 10 stories on the sprint, and each of those stories are worth 2 points, then we are committing to 20 points worth of work. And if by the end of the sprint we have completed all 20 points of work, our team velocity now becomes 20. And so when we plan next time, our new capacity, we know we did 20 points of work last time. We will probably do at least 20 points this time. So we will plan our capacity based on a 20-point velocity. And then as we finish this next sprint, our velocity might be 25. And so our average velocity at that point is around 23. And then we complete the next sprint. So when we keep doing that, we keep averaging our past work to get our current velocity, and we use that velocity to govern and estimate the capacity for future. So here's an example of sprint metrics. Iteration is the same as a sprint. So the vertical is the different sprints, and you can track what the velocity was we planned to do, what the velocity was we actually achieved, and again, we only count the story points of the stories we've actually finished. So if we commit to 10 stories worth 20 points, and we only finish 8 stories, we've only achieved a subset of our commitment. So rather than achieving all 20 points, we've only actually achieved 16 points. And so our planned velocity was 20, our actual velocity was only 16. Likewise, tracking how many stories we plan versus how many are accepted or completed. You can track quality through all of this as well. A lot of good metrics, and this is just out of a sprint, a single sprint. So we could have all this information after 2 weeks. And we can expand that. So that was a single team. We can lift that up to a program or multiple teams. In this case, PSI does not mean property solutions. It means potentially shippable increment, which is essentially a single sprint for all the teams. So we have 10 teams. Every team has a velocity of 20, and so our program velocity is 10 times 20. and we just expand the previous metrics to go across the entire program or all the teams. Cadence is, again, a very important thing to keep in mind. We plan at specific intervals. We release after specific intervals. We do retrospectives after specific intervals. Those intervals don't change. If you can picture your cadence as you walk or run, it's very hard to keep a consistent pace or consistent velocity if you keep changing the distance of your steps or your cadence. If you change the cadence while you run, you will almost always fall down. It's just very hard to keep pace with that. So cadence is very important, and it's a very valuable metric because if we have the same cadence and we start and stop sprints at the same time every time, then we will know that in December we will have 2 sprints, and both those sprints will start on these dates. That's very valuable, which we'll see in a second why. The burn down chart is a very valuable metric. As you can see, it tracks on the vertical, it tracks story points, and on the horizontal, it tracks the iterations. And this can even be within a single sprint, so the horizontal would be actually days. But either way, you track, so this team has 500 story points. So their backlog, as they have estimated it, contains a total of 500 points. And they've estimated 5 sprints to complete those 500 points. So in an ideal world, they would follow this straight line to complete that by the end of the 5th sprint. But we have the actual. So the plan was to be done with 100 points after the first iteration. Unfortunately, we only got done about 75. That's not an answer to a problem. It's just a fact. That 75 might be because there were impediments. It could be because we had somebody that was sick that week and didn't plan for it. So it's not an answer, it's just a fact. But then as you can see, the rate was consistent after that, and it actually followed the same ideal rate as the plan, which is doing pretty dang good. So the burn down chart, it burns down the story points so that you start with a number, and by the end you burn down to 0. Now this example is over multiple sprints, but again, this could be within a single sprint, so that's day 1, day 2, day 3, which again brings value in having stories that are small so that we can burn down our stories over a couple days. If we have huge stories, our burn down chart will be flat for a few days and have virtually no visible progress until all of a sudden, day 4, it drops, and then we're flat. Which, in the end, that may be doable, but on day 2, that provides no value. Because day 2, if it was flat, we just show no progress, which is not valuable. So again, those stories need to be small enough to show that progress over time. So we have burn down chart. We also have burn up charts, which is the same idea but reversed. So rather than saying in the burn down chart we start with 500 and we have this much left, the burn up chart says we have achieved 6 and we have achieved 8 points, and we've achieved 31 points, and we've achieved 41 points, 45, and you can track this with business value. That's essentially 6 points of business value delivered. And that's 18 points of business value delivered. This blue line is the total. So here we see for the first 5 sprints, we have a total of 100 story points in the backlog. So by the end of the burn up chart, your total and your completed should intersect. And since the backlog is dynamic, it looks like in sprint 6, we actually added more work to the backlog, which is totally fine. We just added more work, we added more estimates, and so we have more. But we keep adding more value after every sprint. So you can track the value add through a burn-up chart, through tracking that velocity and those story point estimations. This one is very valuable. I really like this progress report. This is meant to be used inside of a sprint if you keep these as stories, but really it's good to be at the feature level. So as we said before, a feature contains multiple epics which contain multiple stories. So feature 10, let's say, has 100 stories. At this point, this is a snapshot for a single day, right? So at this day, feature 10 should be 30% completed. If it's 100 stories, we should have 30 stories done by this day. In actuality, we've only got 20 done, right? Similarly, feature 9, if it has 100 stories, we should be at 28% completed. In actuality, we're about 26. That's what each one of these means. The colors, the top line is the plan. The green line or yellow line is the actual if it is within 15% of the plan. So in this case, feature 9, yeah, we're about 2% less than what we thought we could be. But that's a very small variance. We can accept that. Whereas feature 10, that's quite a large variance. So that one is at risk right now. It's not an answer, it's just a fact. And we need to dive into that to understand why we're so far behind. Or feature 4 is even further behind. So very valuable. And again, this is a snapshot for a single day. So every day or every sprint, these numbers are going to change because by the end of the 5th sprint, you would expect this to be higher in plan, and then the committed or the actual will be higher. So this one is a living document that increases every day. So tying with this is our predictability measure. Predictability is a very valuable tool as well. And a lot of executives in different surveys, with agile surveys, predictability is more valuable than being on target and being correct with all the estimates. You can estimate all you need to, but at the end, if your team is not predictable enough, then your estimate is of no use. So here in this example, we have an effective control range. So this company has said anywhere from 80% to 100% is acceptable. Again, perfection is too expensive. Just because a team does not finish everything every sprint does not mean they have failed completely. This company has said as long as we get at least 80% done every sprint, then we're okay. Well, if you look at these two teams, Team B achieved, 95% the first time. They dropped, unfortunately, outside of our range, down to about 70. But then they shot back up again to over 100, and they're back down to 90. So overall, they are somewhat predictable. There's a lot of variance still, but they're at least predictable. They will be at least within this range. Whereas Team A, they went from 60 down to 35 or 30, shot up to 90, down to 70. They're completely out of whack. They're unpredictable, and we can't really take anything that that team gives us to heart because we don't know what will actually happen because they're so unpredictable. Again, it's not an answer to a problem. It's just a fact, and it leads to a future conversation to understand that. But we can measure predictability using the committed stories versus actual stories and story points versus actuals. So I know a lot of you guys online are client execs, and you're probably wondering, who cares? What's the importance about all this? So here's an example that we have very often every day. So we have a specific story ABC, and we want to know when will story ABC be done. Well, I have a backlog And I can see that story ABC has been prioritized and is currently number 125 in the list. And we've already actually estimated it, and that's at 5 points. Our team velocity right now is currently 46 points. And if we took the value of all the points of items 1 through 124, let's say that is 565 points in the backlog in front of this story. So we take 556 points plus the 5 points for this story is the total number of story points. We divide that by our velocity of 46, and we come out with 13 sprints. So if nothing changes, it'll take about 13 sprints for us to get to this story. And we already know that we have the same cadence, so sprints are always 2 weeks. 13 sprints times 2 weeks per sprint is 26 weeks. So based on a consistent cadence, our next sprint will start on June 21st. We release every Thursday. The team is 87% predictable. So taking all of that into account, I can say that based on the current state of the product, I'm 87% confident that story ABC will be released around or by December 19th. That is the release after the end of the 13th sprint. So if we had all of those metrics in line today, we can easily answer that question. When will this be done? And I can give you a relative estimate. Again, it's an estimate, not a commitment. It won't be committed to until in December when the team actually does sprint planning for that story. But relatively speaking, I'm fairly confident it'll be around December when we get to that story. And that's very valuable information that we can take from all that. So that was a lot of information. I breezed through that one. Apologize if there was a lot of information, too much information. But does anybody have any questions? Let me unmute. So anybody online have any questions?
Can you hear me, Tony?
Yep.
No, just the story point ones that I had before, but I think you answered them pretty well.
So you don't have any questions?
I think I'm good.
Okay. Anybody in the room have any questions? Awesome. Then, so let's go back to our course goal. Hopefully by the end of this very fast crash course, you've gotten some information. You can now define some things about Scrum. You know who pigs are and who chickens are. You know who you are. You know how to write a user story. There's many things we covered more, but at least you hopefully can do that. And as extension, hopefully now we can understand Dilbert a little better. Just because we're agile doesn't mean we don't plan. We just plan when we need to. And we only plan what we need to. Just because we're agile doesn't mean we do things faster with fewer people. We can change faster. Just because we're agile in Scrum doesn't mean we can do everything all the time. We need definitions. And those definitions need to be reasonable. We need to have stories that are small, that are consumable, estimable, testable. We need to have reasonable requirements, understanding that we probably can't and won't get to everything. But that's okay, as long as we're delivering the most valuable things first.